Ukraine at critical, the war no one wants to lose. Let me take you back to February 23, 2024, not the anniversary of the invasion, but the day the U.S. House of Representatives finally passed the $61 billion Ukraine aid package after months of political theater. The headlines were Biden signs bill, Ukraine gets lifeline, Putin's gamble fails as West stands firm. The official narrative was clear: democracy was prevailing, the rules-based order was holding, and with enough weapons, Ukraine would push Russia back to its 1991 borders. But here's the if you followed this conflict as closely as I have for the past 2 years, you know that moment wasn't a turning point, it was a delay of the inevitable. I've spent 4 decades studying warfare, from the Cold War's nuclear standoffs to the failed interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and written books on how great powers miscalculate. And what I see in Ukraine today isn't just another war, it's the collision of 2 irreconcilable visions of the world, a proxy conflict that has already reshaped global power, and a crisis that the West still refuses to understand. The mainstream media tells you this is about freedom versus tyranny, but that's a children's story. The truth is far darker, far more complex, and far more dangerous. And if we don't confront it now, we may not get another chance. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like in 2022, Vladimir Putin, a modern-day Hitler, launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine to rebuild the Russian Empire. The brave Ukrainian people, led by the Churchillian Volodymyr Zelensky, fought back with Western weapons and sheer determination. The US and NATO, acting as the world's moral compass, provided billions in aid, trained Ukrainian troops, and imposed crippling sanctions that have brought Russia to its knees. The war is a clear-cut battle between good and evil, democracy and autocracy, and with enough support, Ukraine will win a decisive victory. The numbers seem to back this up. Since 2022, the US has sent over $175 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine. NATO has exited with Finland and Sweden joining, signaling unity. Russian casualties, according to US intelligence, exceed 300,000 dead and wounded. The ruble is weak, Russian oil is selling at a discount, and Putin's regime is isolated. The narrative is reinforced daily by think tanks, government officials, and media. Stay the course, and Ukraine will prevail. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's fundamentally misleading. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most glaring: Ukraine is losing. Not in spirit, not in courage, but on the battlefield. The much-hyped 2023 counteroffensive was a disaster. After months of training and billions in Western arms, Ukraine gained a few miles of territory at the cost of tens of thousands of soldiers and the destruction of entire brigades. The Russian military, once dismissed as a paper tiger, has adapted. It now outproduces NATO in artillery shells, deploys electronic warfare that neutralizes Western drones, and has fortified its positions with layers of trenches and minefields that make the Western Front of World War I look like a speed bump. Then there's the manpower issue. Ukraine's population is a third of Russia's. Zelensky has lowered the conscription age to 25, but even that won't be enough. The New York Times reported in December that Ukrainian forces are outnumbered 5-1 in some sectors. Meanwhile, Russia has mobilized its economy for war, producing tanks, missiles, and drones at a rate that dwarfs Ukraine's capacity. The idea that Ukraine can win in the traditional sense, that it can push Russia out of all occupied territories, including Crimea, is a fantasy. But here's where it gets interesting. The West doesn't actually want Ukraine to win. At least, not in the way the hawks in Washington and Brussels claim. If Ukraine were to achieve a total victory, it would mean the collapse of Putin's regime, a scenario that terrifies Western leaders. Why? Because a Russia in chaos is far more dangerous than a Russia under Putin. A fractured Russia could lead to nuclear weapons in the hands of warlords, a refugee crisis of biblical proportions, and a power vacuum that China or even Islamist militants could exploit. The US and Europe have no plan for what comes after Putin, so they're content to bleed Russia slowly, even if it means bleeding Ukraine in the process. And let's talk about those sanctions. The West assumed that cutting Russia off from SWIFT and seizing oligarchs' yachts would cripple its economy. Instead, Russia pivoted to Asia. China, India, and the Gulf states have become Russia's new economic lifelines. Russian oil is still flowing, just at a discount. The ruble is weaker, but the Russian economy has avoided collapse. Meanwhile, Europe is paying the price: skyrocketing energy costs, deindustrialization, and a cost of living crisis that's fueling populist backlash. The sanctions have hurt the West as much as they've hurt Russia. Then there's the elephant in the NATO action. For years, I've warned that NATO's eastward creep was a provocation, not a deterrent. The 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO declared Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join, was a red line for Moscow. Putin made that clear in his 2007 Munich speech. The West ignored him. Then came the 2014 Maidan coup, which Russia saw as a US-backed regime change. The Minsk agreements, meant to resolve the Donbass conflict, were never implemented. Instead, the US and UK trained Ukrainian forces, supplied them with weapons, and encouraged Kyiv to take a hardline stance. Putin's invasion was a disaster, but it wasn't unprovoked. And now, the most dangerous delusion of the belief that this war can be won without escalation. The US and NATO are already deeply involved. American intelligence helped Ukraine sink the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. British and American special forces have been operating in Ukraine for years. Western weapons have struck deep inside Russia. And yet, we're told that this is still a proxy war, that NATO isn't a combatant. That's a legal fiction. Russia sees NATO as the enemy, and every new weapons shipment, every intelligence briefing, every drone strike on Russian soil brings us closer to direct conflict. The geopolitical how we got here. To understand Ukraine, you have to understand the bigger game. This isn't just about one country, it's about the future of global order. For the past 30 years, the US has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the belief that America can and should reshape the world in its image. After the Cold War, we exited NATO, bombed Serbia, invaded Iraq, and tried to turn the Middle East into a sea of democracies. It didn't work. The unipolar moment is over. China has risen. Russia has reasserted itself. The global South is no longer willing to follow Washington's lead. And yet, the US foreign policy establishment still operates as if the 1990s never ended. Russia, meanwhile, sees itself as a civilizational state, a unique power with its own values, history, and sphere of influence. Putin isn't Hitler. He's a realist in the tradition of Metternich or Bismarck. He believes in balance of power, not universal democracy. He watched as NATO exited to Russia's borders, as the US-backed color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, and as American missiles were placed in Poland and Romania. From his perspective, this isn't about imperialism, it's about survival. China, the third player, is the most calculating of all. Beijing doesn't want Russia to win, but it doesn't want Russia to lose either. A weakened Russia is in China's interest. It makes Moscow more dependent on Beijing, gives China access to Russian resources, and keeps the US distracted in Europe. But a collapsed Russia would be a nightmare for China, leading to instability on its northern border. So China plays both. It buys Russian oil, sells Russia dual-use technology, and presents itself as a neutral mediator, all while quietly ensuring that the war drags on. This is the multipolar world in action. The US wants to maintain its dominance. Russia wants to reclaim its status as a great power. China wants to replace the US as the global hegemon. And Ukraine? It's the battleground where these competing visions collide. Military: why this war can't be won. Let's talk about the military situation, because this is where the rubber meets the road. The US and NATO have poured an astonishing amount of firepower into Ukraine: HIMARS, Abrams tanks, Patriot missiles, F-16s. But here's the hard: technology alone doesn't win wars. If it did, the US would have won in Afghanistan in weeks. What wins wars is manpower, industrial capacity, and will. And on all three counts, Russia has the advantage. Russia is now a war economy. Its defense production has surged. It's churning out 250,000 artillery shells a month, more than the US and Europe combined. It's deploying new tanks, new drones, and new electronic warfare systems that neutralize Western advantages. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of soldiers. The average age of a Ukrainian frontline fighter is now over 40. The country's population is shrinking, and Zelensky's government is struggling to fill the ranks. Then there's the escalation ladder. The West keeps moving the goalposts. First, it was javelins. Then HIMARS. Then tanks. Then long-range missiles. Now, it's F-16s. Each step brings us closer to direct conflict. Russia has already warned that Western weapons striking inside Russia would be considered an act of war. If a Ukrainian F-16, flown by a NATO-trained pilot, bombs a Russian city, what happens next? Does Putin retaliate against NATO bases in Poland? Does he use tactical nukes? The hawks in Washington dismiss these concerns as Russian bluffing. But I've studied nuclear strategy for decades. This is not a bluff. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The US has a long record of underestimating its adversaries. In Vietnam, we thought superior firepower would crush the Viet Cong. In Iraq, we thought shock and awe would lead to a quick victory. In Afghanistan, we thought we could build a democracy in a country that had never had one. Each time, we were wrong. And each time, the cost was measured in blood and treasure. Ukraine is no different. The idea that we can arm Ukraine to victory without risking a wider war is a dangerous fantasy. The longer this conflict drags on, the greater the risk of miscalculation. And in a war between nuclear powers, miscalculation is how Armageddon begins. The domestic why this war won't end. So why does the US keep fueling this conflict? The answer lies in domestic politics. For the Biden administration, Ukraine is a legacy issue. Biden has staked his presidency on the idea that America is the leader of the free world, that democracy must prevail over autocracy. If Ukraine falls, it's a personal defeat. It's also a defeat for the entire post-Cold War foreign policy establishment, the think tanks, the defense contractors, the diplomats who have built their careers on the idea of American global leadership. Then there's the military-industrial complex. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're making billions from this war. Every new weapons package is a windfall. And they have powerful allies in Congress. The late Senator John McCain once said, "Defense spending is the only part of the budget that's not subject to debate." He was right. The Pentagon's budget has grown every year since 9/11, regardless of which party is in power. Ukraine is just the latest excuse to keep the money flowing. And let's not forget the 2024 election. Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is weak. Inflation is still a problem. But Ukraine? That's one issue where he can still claim moral leadership. The Republicans are divided, some want to cut aid, others want to escalate. But the administration knows that if it pulls the plug on Ukraine, it loses its last remaining argument for re-election. Then there's the media. The war in Ukraine has been a goldmine for cable news. It's dramatic, it's black and white, it fits neatly into the good versus evil narrative that sells ads. The more the war drags on, the more clicks it generates. And the more clicks it generates, the more the media pushes for escalation. This is how wars become self-sustaining. No one wants to be the one to say, enough. No one wants to admit defeat. So the money keeps flowing, the weapons keep coming, and the bodies keep piling up. 3. Where do we go from here? So what happens next? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1, the miracle. Ukraine launches a successful counteroffensive, breaks through Russian lines, and forces Putin to the negotiating table. A ceasefire is declared, and Ukraine joins NATO as a reward for its bravery. The West declares victory, and the war fades from the headlines. This is the fairy tale ending. It's what the hawks in Washington are praying for. But it's also the least likely outcome. Russia is dug in. Its economy is on a war footing. And Putin has shown no willingness to retreat. Even if Ukraine somehow pushes Russia back, the cost in lives and treasure would be staggering. And let's be honest, NATO isn't going to war with Russia over Donetsk. Scenario 2, the long grind. The war drags on for years, becoming a frozen conflict like Korea or Cyprus. Ukraine holds the line, but Russia keeps the territories it has captured. The US and Europe continue sending weapons, but the flow slows as domestic opposition grows. Sanctions remain in place, but Russia adapts. The death toll rises, the economy stagnates, and the world moves on until the next crisis. This is the most likely outcome. It's also the most dangerous, because it guarantees endless war. Neither side can win, but neither side can afford to lose. And the longer it goes on, the greater the risk of escalation. Scenario 3, the nightmare. Ukraine collapses. Russian forces break through the front lines, and Kyiv falls. Zelensky flees, and a pro-Russian government is installed. NATO ICS and sends troops to stabilize the situation. Russia responds by striking NATO supply lines. The US retaliates. And suddenly, we're in World War III. This is the scenario no one wants to talk about. But it's not impossible. If Ukraine's defenses crumble, if NATO miscalculates, if Putin feels cornered, this is where we end up. And once the nukes start flying, there's no going back. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. Here's the heart: America's foreign policy is broken. For 3 decades, we've operated under the delusion that we can reshape the world in our image. We've spent trillions on wars, nation building, and democracy promotion. And what do we have to show for it? Iraq is a failed state. Afghanistan is back under Taliban rule. Libya is a warlord's paradise. Syria is a humanitarian catastrophe. And now, Ukraine is on the brink. The problem isn't a lack of power. The problem is a lack of strategy. We keep making the same. 1. We overestimate our ability to control events. We thought we could turn Iraq into a democracy. We thought we could build Afghanistan from scratch. We thought we could arm Ukraine to victory. Each time, we were wrong. 2. We underestimate our adversaries. We dismissed the Taliban as a ragtag militia. We called Putin a KGB thug who would fold under pressure. We assumed China would liberalize as it grew richer. Each time, we were humbled. 3. We ignore the limits of military power. You can't bomb an idea. You can't drone strike a culture. You can't impose democracy at gunpoint, and yet, we keep trying. 4. We refuse to accept multipolarity. The world is no longer unipolar. China is rising. Russia is reasserting itself. The global south is charting its own course. And yet, the US foreign policy establishment still acts as if we can dictate terms to the rest of the world. This is the hubris of empire. And like all empires before us, we're learning the hard way that power has limits. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? Do we just surrender? Do we let Putin have Ukraine? No. But we need to stop pretending that this war can be won on the battlefield. We need to start thinking like realists. Here's what a sane strategy would look. 1. Freeze the conflict. Push for a ceasefire, even if it means Ukraine ceding some territory. The alternative is endless war, and endless war benefits no one. 2. Negotiate from strength. The US and Europe should make it clear that if Russia violates the ceasefire, the sanctions will return harder than ever. But we should also offer Russia away sanctions relief, reintegration into the global economy, and a seat at the table in a new European security architecture. 3. Rebuild Ukraine. The West should commit to rebuilding Ukraine's economy, not just arming it. That means infrastructure, education, and governance reform. It means making Ukraine a success story, not a perpetual war zone. 4. Rethink NATO. NATO action was a mistake. It provoked Russia without making Europe safer. We need a new security framework, one that includes Russia, not isolates it. 5. Focus on China. The real long-term threat isn't Russia, it's China. We're wasting resources in Ukraine when we're squandering them in Eastern Europe. China isn't sitting idle while we pour $100 billion into a war that's already cost Ukraine 70,000 dead soldiers and counting. Beijing is watching, calculating, and quietly building the military and economic infrastructure to dominate the Indo-Pacific. And what are we doing? We're bogged down in a conflict that, even if we win, only weakens us for the real fight ahead. Let me explain why this matters. The Pentagon's own 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing challenge and Russia as an acute threat. That's bureaucrat speak. China is the main event, Russia is the sideshow. But you wouldn't know it from our actions. Since February 2022, we've sent Ukraine more artillery shells than we produce in a year. We've depleted our own stockpiles to the point where, according to a leaked Pentagon document from last October, we'd run out of key munitions in a matter of days if a major conflict with China erupted. That's not strategy, that's strategic malpractice. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of warfare itself. Russia's invasion has been a laboratory for the next generation of combat. Drones, electronic warfare, hypersonic missiles, these aren't futuristic concepts anymore. They're being battle-tested in real time, and the lessons are being absorbed in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. Meanwhile, we're still fighting with a playbook from the 1990s. Our generals talk about multi-domain operations, but when was the last time the US military actually won a war? Iraq? Afghanistan? Libya? We're great at toppling regimes, but we've forgotten how to fight and win against a peer adversary. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia isn't the Soviet Union. It's not a global ideological rival. It's a regional power with a GDP smaller than Italy's, a shrinking population, and an economy that's been hollowed out by corruption and sanctions. But it's also a nuclear-armed state with a leader who's shown he's willing to escalate when cornered. That's not a threat we can ignore, but it's not an existential one either. The real danger is that we've convinced ourselves that this war is about democracy versus autocracy, when in reality, it's about something far more: power, pride, and the inability of the West to accept that its unipolar moment is over. Take NATO action. I was in the room when the decision was made to push the alliance eastward in the 1990s. I argued against it then, and I'll argue against it now. The idea that we could extend NATO to Russia's borders without provoking a response was either naive or reckless. George Kennan, the architect of our Cold War containment strategy, warned in 1997 that NATO action would be a fateful error. He was right. Putin isn't Hitler, he's a thug, but he's also a rational actor who sees NATO as an existential threat. And when you back a nuclear power into a corner, you shouldn't be surprised when it lashes out. But the establishment refuses to learn. Instead of rethinking our approach, we double down. We send F-16s to Ukraine, knowing full well they won't change the battlefield dynamic but will escalate the conflict. We talk about strategic ambiguity while making it clear we're all in on Ukrainian victory. And we ignore the fact that every dollar we spend in Ukraine is a dollar we're not spending on modernizing our own military for the real fight with China. Let's talk about that fight for a moment. China's military buildup is the most rapid and comprehensive in modern history. In 2000, the PLA Navy had 57 major surface combatants. Today, it has over 340. It's built artificial islands in the South China Sea, turning them into unsinkable aircraft carriers. It's developed hypersonic missiles that can evade our defenses. And it's done all this while we've been distracted by 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East. The Chinese aren't stupid, they see our focus on Ukraine as an opportunity. And they're exploiting it. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon Ukraine. But we need to be honest about what's achievable. The idea that we can defeat Russia and force it out of Crimea and Donbass is a fantasy. Crimea has been Russian since 2014, and the people there, whether we like it or not, see themselves as Russian. The Donbass has been a frozen conflict for nearly a decade. These are facts on the ground, and no amount of Western weapons is going to change them. The best we can hope for is a negotiated settlement that freezes the conflict, preserves Ukrainian sovereignty, and gives Kyiv a path to rebuild. But that requires something the West has been: terrible diplomacy. We've spent the last 2 years telling Zelensky that he can win, that we'll support him as long as it takes. That's not strategy, that's emotionalism. Real strategy requires hard choices. It requires telling allies uncomfortable truths. And it requires accepting that sometimes, the best outcome is the least bad one. Here's what a realistic approach would look like. First, we push for a ceasefire. Not because we're surrendering, but because the alternative is a war that drags on for years, draining resources and lives. Second, we make it clear to Russia that any violation of the ceasefire will trigger devastating sanctions and military support for Ukraine. But we also offer a path to reintegration, sanctions relief, economic incentives, and a seat at the table in a new European security architecture. Third, we commit to rebuilding Ukraine, not just arming it. That means infrastructure, governance reform, and economic investment. It means making Ukraine a success story, not a perpetual client state. And finally, we pivot to China. That means modernizing our military, investing in hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and next-generation drones. It means strengthening our alliances in the Indo-Pacific, South Korea, Australia, India. And it means having the discipline to say no to unnecessary conflicts. Because if we don't, we'll wake up one day to find that while we were busy fighting Russia, China has become the dominant power in Asia and we're left playing catch-up. The establishment will call this appeasement. They'll say we're rewarding aggression. But that's the same tired rhetoric we've heard before. In Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And where did it get us? We need to stop pretending that we can dictate the world order. The era of American hegemony is over. The question is whether we'll adapt or whether we'll keep fighting the last war until we're too weak to fight the next one. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about military strategy or geopolitical maneuvering, it's about the internal dynamics of Ukraine itself. Because while we've been obsessing over F-16s and atoms, Zelensky's government has been steadily losing its grip on the country's political and social fabric. And that's where the real danger lies. Let me explain why this matters. Ukraine in 2024 is not the same country it was in 2022. The initial surge of national unity has long since fractured. The economy is in freefall, GDP contracted by 30% in 2022, and while there was a slight rebound in 2023, the World Bank projects another 3% decline this year. Inflation is running at 20%, the hryvnia has lost nearly 60% of its value against the dollar since the war began, and the black market for basic goods is thriving. The average Ukrainian isn't just fighting for sovereignty anymore, they're fighting for survival. And when people are hungry, cold, and exhausted, their patience wears thin. Here's the uncomfortable: Zelensky's approval ratings have plummeted. In the early days of the war, he was polling at 90%. By late 2023, that number had dropped to around 60%, and in some regions, particularly in the West, it's even lower. The reason? Corruption. Not the kind of corruption we in the West like to tut about from afar, but the kind that affects daily life. Stories of soldiers being sent to the front with substandard equipment, of aid money disappearing into the pockets of oligarchs, of local officials skimming reconstruction funds, these aren't just rumors. They're documented. The Ukrainian government's own anti-corruption agencies have opened over 1,200 cases related to wartime graft since 2022. And yet, no high-profile convictions. No real accountability. Now, you might say, well, in a country where the state is already weak, where trust in institutions was fragile even before the war, this kind of corruption isn't just a nuisance, it's an existential threat. Because when people stop believing in their government, they stop believing in the war effort. And when that happens, the whole house of cards collapses. Take the mobilization issue. Ukraine's military has taken staggering losses. Estimates range from 70,000 to 120,000 dead, with another 150,000 to 200,000 wounded. That's a casualty rate that would break any army. And yet, Zelensky has resisted a full-scale mobilization, fearing the backlash. Instead, he's relied on a patchwork of decrees lowering the draft age to 25, cracking down on draft dodgers, even sending recruitment officers into churches and hospitals. The result? A growing underground economy of bribes to avoid conscription. In some regions, the going rate to get out of the draft is $5,000, a fortune in a country where the average monthly salary is $300. And the people who can't afford to pay? They're the ones getting shipped to the front. That's not just unfair, it's unsustainable. Then there's the political infighting. Zelensky's relationship with his own military leadership has been strained for months. General Valery Zaluzhny, the popular commander-in-chief, was effectively fired in February 2024 after he publicly warned that the war had reached a stalemate and called for a radical overhaul of Ukraine's military strategy. Zelensky replaced him with General Alexander Syrsky, a competent but less charismatic leader who lacks Zaluzhny's public support. The message was dissent will not be tolerated. But here's the problem: when you silence your most effective generals, you don't just lose their expertise. You lose the trust of the men they command. And let's not forget the regional divides. Western Ukraine, which has historically been more nationalist and pro-Western, has borne the brunt of the war's economic pain. Eastern Ukraine, which has deeper cultural and economic ties to Russia, has seen its cities reduced to rubble. The south, particularly around Kherson and Zaporizhia, is a patchwork of occupied and liberated territories, with local populations caught between Russian propaganda and Ukrainian governance. These aren't just abstract divisions, they're fault lines that could tear the country apart if the war drags on. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. The first scenario is the one the Biden administration is betting, that Ukraine can hold out indefinitely with Western support, that Russia will eventually collapse under the weight of sanctions and battlefield losses, and that a negotiated settlement will emerge on terms favorable to Kyiv. It's a nice fantasy, but it ignores a few key realities. 1. Russia's economy is not collapsing. Despite the sanctions, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, and the IMF projects another 2.6% growth this year. 2. Russia's military has adapted. They've ramped up production of artillery shells, drones, and missiles. They've mobilized their defense industry. And they've shown a willingness to absorb casualties that would break any Western army. 3. Western support is not infinite. The U.S. has already committed over $100 billion to Ukraine, and Congress is growing increasingly reluctant to approve more. The EU's $50 billion aid package was only passed after months of infighting. And public opinion in Europe is shifting. Polls show that a majority of Germans and French now favor negotiations over continued military support. The second scenario is the one no one wants to talk: a Ukrainian collapse. Not a sudden surrender, but a slow-motion unraveling. Imagine the front lines stabilize, but Ukraine's economy continues to deteriorate. Mobilization becomes increasingly unpopular, leading to mass desertions and draft dodging. Zelensky's government, facing mounting pressure, cracks down on dissent, further eroding public trust. Local officials in the east and south, seeing no end to the war, begin making quiet deals with Moscow. The West, distracted by other crises, gradually reduces its support. And then, one day, Kyiv wakes up to find that it no longer controls large swaths of its territory. That's not defeatism, that's realism. The third scenario is the one I've been advocating: a negotiated settlement. Not a surrender, but a ceasefire that freezes the conflict, followed by a long-term diplomatic effort to rebuild Ukraine and reintegrate it into Europe. This would require painful concessions, acknowledging that Crimea and parts of Donbass are, for now, lost, agreeing to neutrality, accepting a demilitarized zone along the front lines. But it would also require something from a commitment to withdraw its forces, a pledge not to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs, and a path to sanctions relief. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the least bad option. Now, I know what the hawks will say. Ukraine is at a crossroads, and the choices we make in the next 6 months will determine its fate for decades. If we continue down the current path, pouring money and weapons into a war with no end in sight, ignoring the rot in Kyiv, pretending that Russia can be defeated without risking a wider conflict, we will wake up to a Ukraine that is broken, bankrupt, and bitter. And that's not just a tragedy for Ukraine. It's a strategic disaster for the West. Because here's what the establishment refuses: to this war was never just about Ukraine. It's about the future of European security. It's about whether Russia can be contained without being destroyed. It's about whether the West has the wisdom to adapt to a multipolar world. And right now, we're failing that test. We're so busy fighting the last war that we've forgotten how to think about the next one. And that's a mistake we can't afford to keep making.